Moby, welcome to noise11.com. This should be a remarkable interview because we're talking about two things. We're talking about a life, which you've shown us in your new documentary, and also a moment, which we see in the new album, Reprise. So I'll start off with the movie firstly because it's fascinating. One of the things you say at the start of the movie, our life is very short. We have very short lives with very little significance, and then you go on to make a documentary about yours. Explain that.
I would say that there's an existential component to the movie and a sort of a more psychological human condition component. When, the existential is sort of what you're addressing, which is as humans who are alive for a few decades in a universe that's 15 billion years old, we have no idea what significance or meaning our lives might have in the grand scheme of things. But also on a more psychological level, the main reason for making the documentary was sort of to show how I made this desperate attempt to fix, very deep psychological issues with things like fame or, material success or external validation. And it led me to a lot of depression and anxiety. And obviously I bottomed out as an addict, as an alcoholic, as a drug addict. And so it's sort of a firsthand cautionary tale looking at how I tried to fix psychological issues with external things.
Because I guess, way back in the 90s, you became rich and famous. You came from a very dark past, but into a very affluent lifestyle. But I was rather surprised to find out it wasn't until around 2008 where you actually turned your life around and became the Moby you are today.
I mean, it's a little bit strange when I look back, whether it's like writing a memoir or making this documentary, looking back at who I was in the past, as strange as it might sound, and maybe you'll be able to relate to this or someone will, is I don't even recognize myself in the past. Like I know I'm the same person, but the priorities I had, especially before I got sober, the things that were important to me, the meaning that I gave things, it's very almost disconcerting to look at yourself and not recognize yourself. I mean, I'm sure that that's something I can unpack in therapy, but it's very odd to see your same self, who you were, but almost as a completely different person.
It's a brutally honest documentary, and you tell it in part through scenes with a psychiatrist. Was that actually a real thing for you, going through therapy?
Well, I mean, I've tried everything at this point. I've tried different types of therapy, meditation, spiritual retreats, sobriety. And I almost find that like every different therapeutic modality I've tried has had something wonderful about it. I have yet to find the one size fits all therapeutic approach. Maybe that exists for some people. Maybe for some people that's the church. Maybe for some people it's psychoanalysis. I don't know. But for me, I guess I'm a little bit of a dilettante where I see great benefit in certain parts of a lot of different therapeutic approaches.
To quote one of the lines in the documentary, why did you buy into the culture of fame?
I think it was just fueled by a combination of feelings of inadequacy. Because like, as I talk about in the documentary, I grew up very poor with quite a lot of trauma in my life. My early childhood was filled with a lot of chaos and violence and trauma. And it left me in a place as I became an adult where I was actually quite insecure and in desperate search of external validation. And fame, when it was offered to me, I thought it was going to fix everything. I thought it was, the perfect combination of validation, material success, alcohol and drugs. I just thought that was going to fix every problem I've ever had. But not surprisingly, it didn't really work.
Because, you would think that fame might fix a lot of the past, but here you are on a tour bus, waking up covered in poop after a night of multiple sexual encounters that you couldn't even remember.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot of very, we'll call them like less than enlightened moments. And certainly waking up hungover and sick in a tour bus in a parking lot in Manchester, the UK, and smelling poop and not knowing whose poop it was, I would say that was not one of the brighter moments of my life.
Well, you've certainly made the Motley Crue documentary look G-rated now.
Well, it's funny because I remember when Neil Strauss wrote that book, The Dirt, about Motley Crue, I was surprised and a little concerned that I recognized some of my behavior in what they were doing, because I used to be a philosophy major. I thought I was going to be a philosophy professor at a community college in New England. And, for a while in my life, I had been a very serious Christian. I used to teach Bible study. I never thought that I would be competing with Motley Crue for the title of biggest drunken idiot.
It's certainly a very blunt documentary that is now streaming on lots of platforms around the world. You talk a bit about the animal rights album that you made, which was the punk record. But were you an angry person at that time? Was that the motivation for making a punk record?
Well, I had such a strange musical background. When I was really young, 9 years old, I actually studied classical music and music theory. And then when I was 13, I heard The Clash on the radio. And so I desperately wanted to unlearn my more classical music theory background and just play punk rock songs. But as a result of playing in punk rock bands in high school, I spent a lot of time in the early 80s in nightclubs in New York. And that's what introduced me to hip hop, to electronic music. And so when I made the album Animal Rights, for some reason, for me, it was actually just a product of, we'll call it like dark enthusiasm. There was a lot going on in the world of heavy music at that time that I actually really liked, like bands like Sepultura, Pantera. And at that point, I'd found myself becoming a little bit disenchanted with the rave scene. And I just thought it would be really fun to strap on a guitar and scream at the top of my lungs. And I actually am weirdly proud of that record, which is a bit odd because no one else seemed to actually like it.
There's a part where you talk about working in a record store, and I sort of read between the lines when you're talking about that became a turning point in your life, from working in the record store, being able to buy records, learn how to mix records, then put you on the trajectory that, basically the career took after that.
Yeah, I had a lot of very odd musical experiences that took me out of my comfort zone in a really wonderful way. Because like I said, I thought I was gonna, be playing in punk rock bands and teaching philosophy. Like I really thought that was my life path, whether playing in punk bands or indie bands. Like in the early 80s, I was really into, apart from hardcore punk bands, I was also into the Smiths, bands like Aztec Camera, Echo and the Bunnymen. And it was working in a record store, beginning work as a DJ and spending time in New York that kind of opened me up to these musical traditions that I didn't have a lot of experience with, but that were so exciting, like the beginnings of house music and hip hop and, so much, reggae, dancehall reggae, freestyle. I mean, there were all these musical genres that I knew nothing about that I was so excited by, and that, I was really, really in hindsight grateful to have been exposed to.
It's amazing moving to where you did in New York, and then David Bowie moves in across the road. Not only that, you become great friends.
Yeah, that is still so surprising, because again, to put it in a little bit of perspective, when I was 13 years old, I got my first ever job, which was as a caddy, carrying golf clubs at a very fancy golf course in Connecticut. And again, I'm not a big person. So when I was 13, I was very small. And so I was really a terrible caddy, because to be a good caddy, you have to be able to carry golf clubs. And I was like struggling to carry golf clubs. So they would give me the old golfers who moved more slowly and didn't have a lot of clubs. But I stuck at it, and I made enough money to buy 2 David Bowie albums, because he was my favorite musician of all time. Fast forward to 1999, as you mentioned, we became friends and we were neighbors, and we went on tour together. We spent holidays together. We worked on music together. And there's this one moment that was so precious where he was in my apartment on Mott Street in the Lower East Side of New York. And we played a very delicate, vulnerable version of the song Heroes together, just the two of us on acoustic guitar. And so on this new album, Reprise, or Reprise, depending on how you want to say it, I do a cover of Heroes sort of as a tribute to that moment of playing the greatest song ever written with my favorite musician of all time.
And a magnificent piece. I wanted to ask you about the Australian connection with the album. Alice Skye, the Australian Indigenous singer on track 12, The Great Escape. How did you and her become connected?
Honestly, it was through the magic of Spotify. A lot of what I use streaming services for, all the different streaming services, is finding new musicians, finding singers, and I think I was listening to a new folk playlist, and I heard her voice and I just fell in love with it. And I'm not sure how I reached out to her. It might have been something formal where like I had my managers reach out to her, or what I sometimes do is just like send someone a DM on Instagram and hope that they respond. But I just remember hearing her voice, and just because I'm not a great singer, so when I hear people who have really beautiful, unique voices, I just immediately gravitate towards them.
There's some magnificent curation on this record. Now, to take Moby, Kristofferson and Mark Lanegan, I couldn't think of any 3 completely different people to put together, but on that track, The Lonely Night, it totally works.
Yeah, well, that one, it's interesting because the songs on Reprise, I'd say half of them are songs that a lot of people are familiar with. Some of them were even hits. But the other half are just songs that I wanted to hear done with an orchestra. You mentioned Great Escape, like that was never a hit, but I just really wanted to hear it with, these beautiful voices and an orchestra and a string quartet. And The Lonely Night, it's a song that I wrote with Mark Lanegan a while ago. And I've always been in love with this song. And I really wanted to hear it with Kristofferson's voice. And luckily he agreed to sing it. And the one thing that Mark and Kris and I have in common is we've all been through the ringer of addiction. Obviously musically, career-wise, we've all gone to very different places, but there's that common element of the fact that we have all bottomed out very hard with alcohol and drugs. And sort of that's really what underpins the song itself.
I can't believe Natural Blues is an adult now. It's 21 years old. It's no longer a kid. And I guess that was when we started to see a real depth to your music. That must have been a benchmark song for you. Yeah,
it's funny. I actually, one of the first times I had an inkling that the album Play might be successful was actually in Australia. I was staying at a hotel, I think it was in Melbourne, and the person in the room next to me was listening to Natural Blues. And I'd never had that experience before of being physically close to someone who I didn't know, who was listening to my music. Like I could hear it coming through the door, and it was such an odd, surreal experience to hear my music coming out of a random hotel room. And I mean, as far as like to your point of it, whether it has a degree of sophistication or development, I lack objectivity as regards me and the music I've made. So I hope that you're correct. It sounds really nice, what you said. It would be the height of immodesty if I agreed with you. So I will just thank you for what you said.
Well, another song, Why Does My Heart Feel So Bad, kind of ended the 20th century for you, but that song was written years earlier, I guess around the time of your debut album, but why did it take like half a decade before you actually used it?
Well, part of it was when I first wrote that song, I wrote it as a terrible techno track. Maybe 1991 or 1992, it was the height of the rave scene. And I love rave music. I love good techno tracks. But when I wrote the original version, it was 140 beats per minute and it just didn't work. But I loved those voices. And so what I did is, 7 or 8 years later, tried to rework it as a much slower, prettier, more mournful version. And that ended up being the version that was on the album Play.
I know we're about to run out of time. I wanted to ask you about a show that I really loved, Blunt Talk. Tell me, who was the handsomest bald man on that show?
So Blunt Talk is funny. My friend Jonathan Ames, it was the writer, and he's the man who came up with that. And Jonathan Ames, he also wrote the show Bored to Death with Jason Schwartzman and Zach Galifianakis and Ted Danson, which is one. If you liked Blunt Talk, please go watch Bored to Death, because Bored to Death is wonderful. So Jonathan Ames was asked by Seth MacFarlane, the Family Guy creator, to come up with a show idea for Patrick Stewart. And so he came up with Blunt Talk. And Jonathan thought it would be funny if in the show Blunt Talk, I played Patrick Stewart's younger bald nemesis. And the wonderful thing is, as a result of doing that, Patrick Stewart and I became good friends. But what was especially funny for me, as you know, there are some musicians who are very good actors and a lot of musicians who want to be actors. I've never for a second wanted to be an actor. Like, I'm pretty happy just being a musician and an animal rights activist. And my first real job acting was with Patrick Stewart, who might be the greatest actor of his generation. So I felt a little bit like someone who doesn't know how to play guitar getting a job playing guitar with Jimi Hendrix.
And you had the Australian connection with Alice Skye on the album that we've already talked about in that television show. The Australian connection is Australian television royalty Jackie Weaver.
Oh yeah, Jackie is wonderful in that show. We became friends as a result of that as well. I mean, I have to say, I never knew about the sort of communal family aspect of acting, and I can see now why so many people get seduced by it, because I wasn't a very integral part of the show, but I was on it enough to become friends with the other people on the show. And it really was like having a gang, these funny, bright, smart, talented people, like Patrick Stewart, Jackie Weaver, Ed Begley. I mean, there's just the most Jason Schwartzman's in it as well. And it was really so gregarious and fun. So I don't want to act, but I kind of miss having my little TV gang.
I'll ask you one final question before we go, a question that gets asked in the documentary but doesn't get answered. What happens to us when we die?
I wish I knew. I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who claims to know. I have this completely half-assed sort of new age theory that part of the human condition is ignorance, is that we don't know if our lives have meaning or significance. We don't know what happened before we were born. We don't know what happens after we die. But maybe while we're here, it's almost like the universe has broken off a little piece of itself and given it amnesia for whatever purpose we don't know. But I personally love, in a way, I love the ignorance that I have, that I think we all have around universal significance. So it enables us to just revel in the beauty that's around us, and like just love so many aspects. I mean, there are a lot of problems in the world, obviously, but there's so many beautiful things that we can just take joy in and take comfort in. And then maybe when we die, we're reunited with the source of all of that great beauty. I don't know.
We live in a speck of sand and a speck of time. We all think where we stand is important. So maybe Einstein has all the answers. E equals MC squared, Moby. The answer is there.
I mean, I like, what is it? In the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they have the answer is 42. They just don't know what the question is. At least I think that it's been a long time since I've read it. So I'm sure that some sci-fi nerd is going to hear that and say, it's not 42, it's 23, but I think it's 42, maybe 24. Maybe my dyslexia is kicking in. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, the new album, Reprise, depending on where we are in the world, with the Budapest Art Orchestra in there. I really hope we get to see you perform with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra when we can start getting back on planes in the not-too-distant future.
Yeah, the only thing is, depending on how the next couple of elections go in the United States, if I'm allowed back in Australia, I might just try and claim refugee status, because the United States is a pretty dicey place at this point.
Well, I'll have a chat to Leo Sayer. He's got a spare room in the back of his house in Bowral in New South Wales. He became an Australian. We could do it for you.
Leo Sayer, as in you make me feel like dancing, Leo Sayer?
Leo is now an Australian living just south of Sydney.
I'm very jealous.
We'll get you down here as a citizen one day.
Okay, great.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Moby.
Yeah, pleasure speaking with you as well. Have a good rest of the day.